So that idea of the Book of Psalms as being a virtual temple, that's it's an interesting idea. Not everyone holds to that, but it's a reasonable idea that explains the evidence. The way that Psalms are structured is pretty much like what they said, and it's very clear that the Book of Psalms is useful for an exiled people, and Christians have always valued the Book of Psalms. It's one of the most popular parts of the Bible, which is why things like the Gideon's New Testament has Psalms in it and Proverbs, because that poetry is really valued by people, because we too are a people in exile, and the Psalms have so much to encourage and reassure us. Now, there are also lots of different ways to divide the Psalms up. This is just one way. This is actually from Logos Bible Software, and they have Psalms Explorer. If you can see this in action, it's very cool, because when you zoom in on things, all these little circles which represent the Psalms all move around and do cool things. And these each represent one psalm, and the size is proportionate to how many words are in the psalm. The colours and the groupings are about what type of psalm it is, and the way that they've divided it up is into psalms of praise, psalms of lament. You can see that's the biggest group. So Psalms is not just a book of praise, it's actually got a lot of lamenting in it, which is appropriate for people in exile. Royal psalms, which are talking about the king, and they often they may talk about David, but they often are alluding to the Messiah. Wisdom psalms, Psalm 119 there is the biggest, and Psalm 119 is 22 stanzas on the value of God's word. That's a good one to read your kids in the evening to put them to sleep. And then there's thanksgiving psalms and hymns, which are a little more structured and formal than praise and thanksgiving, and psalms of trust. And there are other ways of breaking these down. There's also something called imprecatory psalms. Sometimes they're taken out into their own category, but in here I think they're mostly in the lament psalms, because usually the imprecatory psalms are those where you're asking God to do something horrible to people, and usually that's when you're upset with those people. So notice that the categories are about the feelings, right? Apart from the royal one, but they're really about feelings, of what the feelings that the Psalms expressing. They're not intellectual topics. So there's not sort of psalms about nature, psalms about computers or something, psalms about people, psalms about government. You could divide psalms up that way, but it's not a natural division, because that's not the primary purpose of psalms. They're there to convey a feeling, and so the psalms are always divided along those lines. No matter how you divide it, it's that sort of line. Now, common mistakes that people make in interpreting the psalms. Okay. One is to over-interpret the images, to think that this, it's like apocryphal language, not apocryphal, apocalyptic language. Psalms are not apocalyptic, so the images in Psalms don't correspond to some secret meaning, some cryptic meaning. They're not ciphers for something else. They do mean something. So an eagle means power and strength and that sort of thing, but it doesn't mean, for example, the Roman Empire. In apocalyptic poetry, an eagle may mean the Roman Empire, but in Psalms it doesn't have that sort of correspondence. It's rather talking about the thing that evokes those feelings, so the power and the majesty. and perhaps the predatory nature of it. And also, another mistake that people make is that they think that the images or the imagery that's being used is fictional, is made up. It's often not fictional at all. It would have no power if it was fictional. The power of a psalm is in the fact that it's making that link between a real thing and such as the stars, the heavens, or nature, or the history of Israel, and something else, such as your own relationship with God, or God's faithfulness to you now. So it's key that those things, the images, be real, be factual. Otherwise, they have no power. So don't make the mistake of thinking that just because it's imagery, the imagery is not true. The imagery is true, but it's not the point. The imagery is just trying to express the emotional power and reveal a deeper meaning. Another mistake is to underinterpret the images, to read them literally. And obviously scriptures are not, Psalms are not intended to be read as if they're just a scientific textbook or something like that. There's a tension here, right? The images are factual, so sometimes when the Psalms talks about nature, it's talking about the factual, the actual condition of nature. So it is talking about scientific realities, but that's not the point. But other times it uses it, for example, anthropomorphizes or things like that. So you need to hold that intention and interpret it appropriately. So don't go too far either way, and discern. You need to apply discernment to that interpretation. And so in some ways the interpretation of Psalms will change over time as you understand more or less about the imagery of that the Jews used, and also about the reality, the nature of the world. So, for example, if and this is to do with the cultural context. If you're thinking about, for example, Psalm 137, where it finishes with the desire that people would smash the babies against rocks, initially you might be tempted to think, well, these Israelites were incredibly horrible people, right? But the reality is that in the cultural context of the ancient Near East, in fact in the cultural context of the current Near East, not near to us, near to England. I don't know why we use English language in Australia, but anyway, English imagery. Those cultures use trash talk. They say outrageous things to encourage each other, to encourage their people, and to try to scare their enemies. They don't necessarily mean that they're going to actually do that. Now, sometimes it's not just trash talk. Sometimes those things do actually happen, but there is a significant element of exaggeration and hyperbole in that, and you see it in, for example, in Egyptian records and stuff. Yeah, the Egyptians were great at trash talking. So,
but still, their insult. It's your mother is a donkey, and
yeah.
It's that type of thing.
Yeah.
Compared to like just a one-word insult, it's always got that element of hyperbole.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And when you read like Sennacherib's account, in which we read about how that's where we get sort of a confirmation of Hezekiah's rescue by God from Sennacherib. He's going around talking about how he stomped all over everyone, and it's such vivid, expressive language, and some of it's undoubtedly exaggerated. So that sort of
we have the same in English, don't we? When we say things like "Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater."
yes,
Similar sort of thing.
yeah. So if you're not aware that that's just a metaphor, it sounds pretty violent, right? And we have, when you talk about sports, you use all sorts of incredibly violent imagery, but we're just used to it, so we don't even notice how violent it is. So although our culture is becoming more and more literal, so if people say things like, I'm going to smash you,
You think they might?
then people are starting to get offended. They're like, oh, you can't say that sort of thing. You need to give me a trigger warning. So we're actually moving further away from the ancient cultures. So it's making the Bible harder to understand in that sense. So just cast your mind back to when you were a kid, or before you were a kid if you're younger, and you'll understand the Bible a little bit better. Maybe read some Shakespeare or something. Shakespeare's got lots of robust language. So now let's do a quick workshop. We've got a few more because I want to look at Proverbs and Song of Songs as well. I put Song of Songs in there for the young people, but so choose a short psalm because you don't want to bite off too much work. Choose a short psalm and then figure out what category it is from those categories, and choose some verses in that psalm and describe the type of parallelism. Is it synonymous? Is it the step parallelism, or is it the antithetical or the contrasting parallelism? And then find some examples of figurative language and explain what that makes you feel. How it's actually, what it's moving you towards, what images, what emotions, what perspective that creates, and then explain what you think it's getting at, the underlying truth that's revealing. So just let's do that quickly.